Canada is home to some of the largest reserves of critical minerals in the world. We have lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, and rare earth elements. They're all widely available here. How Canada can become more self-sufficient in the face of an ongoing trade war with the U.S.
Nickel rarely makes headlines, yet it sits at the heart of stainless steel and many electric vehicle batteries. In 2025, as global tariffs reshaped supply chains, the metal became more than a commodity. It became leverage. Under the policies described in your provided context, the United States imposed broad tariffs in August, with rates that reached well beyond earlier baselines. Canada adjusted on multiple fronts, but one strategic question remains. If talks stall and pressure rises, could nickel become the tool Canada uses to protect its own economy while signaling strength at the negotiating table? That is the thread we follow today, and it begins with understanding Canada's real weight in this market. Canada increased nickel output from about 159,000 tons in 2023 to roughly 190,000 tons in 2024, according to figures captured in the context you provided from Natural Resources Canada and USGS. On the trade side, Canada exported about 99.6 thousand tons of primary nickel products in 2023, worth roughly 3.2 billion Canadian dollars, and the United States purchased nearly half of that volume. USGS data summarized in your context adds an important layer for the U.S. market. Across 2020 through 2023, roughly 46% of U.S. primary nickel imports came from Canada, while U.S. apparent consumption ran near 84,000 tons per year. Domestic U.S. mining exists, but it is limited in scale compared with demand. This pattern makes Canada a nearby, reliable supplier, and it places nickel alongside oil, gas, and potash as one of Canada's quiet sources of bargaining power. Leverage only matters if substitution is hard and time is short. For the United States, replacing a large share of Canadian nickel quickly would be difficult. Based on the consumption baseline of about 84,000 tons and the import share figures noted above, a sharp Canadian restriction could create an effective shortfall on the order of 30 to 40,000 tons over a full year, even after tapping alternate suppliers and scrap. The cost impact can be sketched with a transparent back-of-the-envelope method. Using the average 2024 London Metal Exchange nickel price level referenced in your context, around $17,000 per ton, total annual primary nickel expenditures would be near $1.43 billion. A supply squeeze that lifts effective prices by 20 to 30% would add roughly $290 to $430 million in direct nickel costs over a year. This is not a forecast, it is a scenario built from the numbers in the materials you provided, but it illustrates why nickel gets policymakers' attention. The first impact would show up where nickel is used most. USGS end-use shares in your context indicate that the majority of nickel demand goes into stainless steel and high-performance alloys. Those inputs feed equipment makers, industrial hardware, and consumer appliances. Margins would compress until producers could pass costs through. The second impact would touch electric vehicle supply chains that use nickel-rich chemistries. Even with the rise of lower-cost LFP batteries, many platforms still rely on nickel for higher energy density. A sustained bump in nickel costs would slow planned price reductions for some models and could delay investment decisions at the margin. None of this requires a full export ban. A partial restriction, a new export condition, or tighter logistics would likely be enough to move prices and focus minds in Washington. For Canada, the trade-off is real because the U.S. is a large and convenient buyer. For the United States, the risk is also real because Canadian nickel is not easily replaced on short notice. In a trade war defined by tariffs, this is one pressure point that both sides understand, and it explains why nickel is now part of the strategic conversation.
Our steel plants, which are really, really important. I've been saying they're the crown jewels of our manufacturing sector. And we can't think that Canada can have a strong national security if we don't have steel made in Canada. So of course, we need to help them pivot, retool.
For decades, Canadian steel has been a vital piece of the U.S. auto supply chain. American carmakers have relied on Canadian mills for the grades needed to build millions of vehicles. Trump's sectoral tariffs, framed as a push to revive U.S. production, are instead pushing automakers toward thinner margins, layoffs, and rising costs. Canada is pursuing a careful strategy. On one side, it remains at the negotiating table, seeking relief through trade talks. On the other, it is preparing a bold shift, redirecting steel production to strengthen the domestic economy and reduce reliance on the U.S. market. That shift raises a larger question now hanging over Detroit. What happens if U.S. automakers suddenly find themselves short of Canadian steel?
When you're thinking of retooling, obviously we know that the type of steel, for example, in the steel sector that was developed in Canada is mainly steel that is for the U.S. automakers.
Canadian leaders have made it clear that steel is more than an export product. It is described as one of the crown jewels of the manufacturing sector, central to both jobs and national security. For decades, Canadian mills supplied U.S. automakers, producing exactly the grades needed for car frames, panels, and components. That dependency is now seen as a vulnerability. The new strategy is to pivot production. Plants are being encouraged to shift towards steel for housing construction, rail and port infrastructure, and even defense applications. The vision is wide-ranging: aerospace, shipbuilding, and the shipyards that maintain the armed forces. This is not only about securing a domestic industrial base. It is about ensuring that thousands of men and women in the steel sector keep working in jobs that are less exposed to political shocks south of the border. By broadening steel output into critical areas of home building and defense, Ottawa is rewriting the industrial playbook. Instead of being locked into a cycle of dependence on U.S. auto demand, Canada is building resilience into its economy.
We don't need cars from Canada. We don't need energy from Canada. We don't need anything from Canada.
What if Canada stopped supplying steel to U.S. automakers? This is not today's reality, but it is a scenario worth considering. According to the International Organization of Motor Vehicle Manufacturers, U.S. plants built 10.56 million vehicles in 2024. Each car contains about 800 to 900 kilograms of steel, with around 40% used for the body shell. That alone requires close to 3.8 million tons of flat steel each year. Data from the International Trade Administration shows Canada sends about 3.2 million tons of flat-rolled steel to the U.S., with roughly 40% tied to autos. That equals about 1.28 million tons, nearly one-third of the steel used in U.S. car bodies. If that supply vanished, the equivalent of 3.5 million vehicles would lack body steel. Even if U.S. and Mexican producers covered half the gap, production of 1.7 to 2 million vehicles could still face delays. On cost, when supply tightens, auto-grade steel has been shown to rise $150 to $300 a ton. For the 0.36 tons needed per car body, that adds $80 to $200 per vehicle, and spread across industry output, the total impact could reach $1 to $2 billion within months. These are estimated figures, not predictions. They show how much leverage Canada holds and how exposed U.S. automakers could be if tariffs push the relationship to the breaking point. These estimates show how fragile the U.S. auto supply chain could become if Canadian steel is pulled away. And that brings us back to the larger lesson. Trump's tariffs, promoted as part of making America great again, have instead exposed America's own vulnerability. What was meant to strengthen U.S. industry has given Canada a reason to build a stronger, more self-reliant future, and left America's auto sector staring at its own Achilles heel.
Canada has a lot of cards. We have a lot of resources and a lot of trading opportunities that the Americans are very interested in.
While the Prime Minister said before leaving he wants to deepen connections with our allies here in Europe.
The trade clash between Washington and Ottawa has been unfolding for months. In February, after the White House launched emergency tariffs, Canada hit back with broad countermeasures on a wide range of U.S. goods. Earlier this month, President Donald Trump raised tariffs on Canadian non-CUSMA goods to 35%. Instead of escalating further, Ottawa made a calculated shift. Starting September 1st, counter tariffs will be removed on CUSMA-compliant goods, while steel, aluminum, and autos remain protected. This move is not retreat, it is a reset, aligning Canada with the trade rules while keeping pressure on the sectors where its leverage is strongest. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc called it proof that Canada still has many cards in hand.
Electricity may seem invisible, but the numbers tell the story. In 2024, Canada exported nearly 35.7 terawatt-hours of electricity to the United States, worth about 3.1 billion Canadian dollars, according to the Canada Energy Regulator. Imports from the U.S. in the same year were smaller, about 20.9 terawatt-hours. That made Canada a clear net supplier of power across the border. Those flows are not just about dollars. They power close to 1 million American homes, concentrated in northern states where Canadian hydro is often the cheapest and cleanest option. And this comes at a time when U.S. electricity demand is projected to soar. Dominion Energy, which manages part of the grid in the Mid-Atlantic, has forecast that power demand could double over the next 15 years, largely because of data centers and artificial intelligence infrastructure. In this context, the stability of cross-border electricity links becomes even more critical. Electricity is not like oil that can be stored in barrels. It must be transmitted in real time. That means American utilities depend on Canadian reliability every single day. No tariff can change that physics. For Trump, tariffs are a tool of pressure, but in the realm of electricity, Canada holds the steady hand on the switch.
Meeting the German Chancellor is just one of a number of sit-downs planned between Prime Minister Mark Carney and leaders in Germany, Poland, and Latvia. As the trade war with the United States continues, Carney has been focused on diversifying trade, especially with Europe.
Alongside power lines, there is another sector where Canada's leverage runs deep: critical minerals. Canada supplied about 27% of U.S. uranium imports in 2023, based on U.S. Energy Information Administration data. At the same time, the U.S. cut off imports from Russia, making Canadian uranium even more indispensable for American nuclear power plants. The story does not stop at uranium. Canada is also a major producer of nickel, cobalt, and potash, all essential for electric vehicles, batteries, and agriculture. For Washington, the concern is clear. Much of the world's processing of these minerals remains in China, and reducing that dependency has been a bipartisan priority. Canada's reserves, developed under stable political conditions, are a rare alternative. Prime Minister Mark Carney's trip to Europe this week carried this message across the Atlantic. Meetings with German and Polish leaders, along with major CEOs, focused heavily on energy and minerals. Carney's pitch was straightforward. Canada is not only North America's secure supplier, it can also be Europe's. If Ottawa succeeds in building those ties, Washington risks losing the comfort of being Canada's primary customer. Trump's tariffs were meant to corner Canada, but they may end up accelerating Canada's diversification.
Trump's tariffs were designed to tighten the screws, but Canada has turned them into an opportunity. By easing pressure on goods that follow CUSMA rules, Ottawa has shown fairness while keeping firm on the sectors where U.S. dependence runs deep. Electricity and minerals cannot be swapped overnight, and they give Canada a quiet but powerful hand. At the same time, Prime Minister Carney is building trade bridges with Europe, reminding Washington that Canada has options. The outcome is clear. Tariffs have not weakened Ottawa. They have highlighted strengths that Trump cannot undercut, leaving Canada better prepared for the talks ahead.
The headline here is Trump expands 50% steel and aluminum tariffs to include 407 additional product.
I got a problem with that guy. He's signing all these forms, Cleveland Cliffs.
President Donald Trump has once again expanded his trade war. The White House confirmed that tariffs of 50% on steel and aluminum now cover hundreds of additional products. What began with raw materials now includes car parts, refrigerators, baby strollers, even the aluminum in soda cans. For American families, this means higher grocery bills and more expensive cars. For U.S. partners like Canada, it disrupts exports that depend on metal packaging and industrial inputs.
And why doesn't he just stay in the U.S.? Because I'm done with this guy signing letters saying, yeah, bring all the steel down to the U.S., tariff the crap out of Canadians.
This is not just a technical trade measure. It is a shock that links everyday costs with international trade tensions. Let's take a closer look at what this expansion means inside the United States and across North America.
The Trump administration is quietly making it even more expensive to import hundreds of items that all of us would see on store shelves. Well, a whole bunch of household items impacted, and some industrial items too. Look at this: cranes, bulldozers, wind turbines, rail cars.
For consumers, the most immediate effect is inflation. CNN's reporting highlighted that import prices rose sharply in July, defying the White House claim that foreign exporters would absorb the tariffs. Analysts such as Pantheon Economics stressed that American businesses and households are carrying nearly all of the cost. That cost is not small. Supply chain experts have estimated that the expanded tariff list now covers around $320 billion of products, creating roughly $160 billion in extra expenses that flow directly into the economy. Industries tied to steel and aluminum are already reacting. Farmers and builders depend on tractors, gearboxes, pumps, and construction machinery now hit by higher tariffs. Legacy manufacturer John Deere recently announced layoffs at 3 Midwestern facilities, citing weaker sales and the impact of tariffs on production costs. When major employers respond this way, the shock spreads into local communities. The administration's stated goal is to rebuild American steel and aluminum. Yet investment in those sectors requires billions of dollars and long-term certainty. The process so far has been anything but certain. Economists describe it as a policy direction that may be defensible in theory but clumsy in execution. This uncertainty, now often called Trumpian uncertainty, discourages companies from expanding or hiring because tariff rules can change with little warning.
We aren't going to roll over. We aren't going to kiss his backside. We're going to fight like we've never fought before.
Trump's tariff expansion has not gone unanswered. Canada, America's closest trading partner, has pushed back on 2 tracks. At the public level, Ontario Premier Doug Ford has taken direct aim at Washington. He calls the tariffs a hidden tax on American families, noting that Canada buys more than $350 billion of U.S. goods each year. Ford announced a $70 million Canadian dollar program to support workers, pressed Ottawa to tighten quotas on cheap steel, and made it clear Canada will not roll over. On the federal track, Prime Minister Mark Carney has chosen strategic patience. He has directed aid to sectors such as lumber and agriculture while keeping negotiations with Washington open. His government insists Canada will only accept a fair deal, not a short-term fix that weakens national interests. Ford and Carney show 2 sides of one response. Other provinces have also voiced strong opposition, while unions, industries, and policymakers align behind the same message. Canada is standing firm, defending its workers and industries, and refusing to be cornered into a bad deal. The expansion of steel and aluminum tariffs is more than a policy adjustment. For Americans, it means higher prices when inflation is already a concern. For businesses, it adds uncertainty that discourages long-term investment. For Canada, the answer has been resilience. Ottawa and the provinces are backing workers and reinforcing supply chains, sending a message that they will not accept a bad deal. Trump's strategy may unsettle markets, but it also reveals which partners are prepared to stand firm. The coming months will show whether these tariffs strengthen industry or simply confirm that trade wars rarely produce clear winners.
We're more united and more determined to stand up for Canada than at any time in my entire lifetime. We made it clear to President Trump and to the world that Canada is not for sale and Canada will never, ever be a 51st state.
President Trump has been celebrating his tariff campaign as a victory, pointing to the billions collected for Washington. In reality, those tariffs are backfiring at home, driving up prices for American families and adding pressure on U.S. businesses. While the president frames tariffs as proof of American strength, Canada is holding firm. On August 18th, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Premier Doug Ford met in Ottawa to coordinate their response, focusing on how to strengthen competitiveness at home. The contrast could not be sharper. Short-term revenue in Washington, long-term resilience in Canada.
And important discussion with Premier Ford this morning on a variety of aspects for the Ontario economy, the Canadian economy, which of course includes trade but goes much more to the issues that we can control and how we build out from within.
We have to hold firm and we have to create the environment. For instance, the steel sector. You know, the steel sector, we have to look at the large infrastructure projects, shipbuilding, and make sure that large-scale infrastructure projects like a pipeline, the steel pipes come from Ontario.
On August 18th, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Ontario Premier Doug Ford stood side by side in Ottawa. Their focus was not on what Washington might do next, but on building Canada's own strength. Carney stressed the need to focus on housing, on the steel and auto sectors, and on new fields such as artificial intelligence. His point was simple. Canada must build competitiveness from within, not depend on external decisions. Ford delivered the same message in his own way.
We're united on the message of let's start worrying about how we can be competitive here. Donald Trump is so unpredictable. I don't even know if he knows what he's doing tomorrow morning.
He reminded Canadians that Trump is unpredictable, that no one can forecast what the president will announce tomorrow. The answer, he said, is to make Canada the most competitive place to invest by reducing taxes, cutting red tape, and keeping production at home. He cited last year's record numbers. In 2024, Ontario attracted $39.9 billion Canadian dollars in foreign direct investment, creating 25,000 jobs. To him, the challenge is to repeat and expand those results even under the pressure of tariffs. Both leaders framed their approach as a united one. They called it Team Canada, not just a slogan, but a strategy that brings together provinces, Indigenous communities, and businesses. And the message was not only for Canadians. Ford reminded audiences in the United States that tariffs on Canadian goods are effectively taxes on American families because the two economies are so deeply linked. Canada is not standing still. Over the past months, governments at both federal and provincial levels have rolled out packages worth tens of billions of dollars to shield industries and workers. Ontario alone has launched a $1.5 billion financing program for companies hurt by U.S. tariffs and is investing $2.5 billion in skills training so workers can transition into new opportunities. A further $500 million fund has been created to process critical minerals, ensuring that resources mined in Ontario are refined domestically. The effort goes beyond defensive spending. Ontario has signed new internal trade agreements with every other province and territory, removing barriers under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. Officials estimate that could add more than $200 billion to economic output in the coming years. The federal government, meanwhile, continues to prioritize major investments in healthcare, infrastructure, and housing to reinforce social and economic stability. Together, these measures show that Canada is using the tariff crisis as a catalyst for long-term transformation.
Let's stop worrying about Donald Trump. We'll start focusing on Ontario, on Canada, and all the other provinces and territories.
Trump presents tariffs as proof of success, but they are raising costs in his own country. Canada is responding by holding firm and focusing on long-term competitiveness. This is not only a trade fight, it is a test of endurance, and Canada is showing it is ready. Carney and Ford may differ in style, but both underline the same message. Canada is not retreating, not waiting, and not bending. It is adapting, rebuilding, and preparing for the next decade. Trump's tariffs may have set the stage, but Canada has chosen to write its own script. And in this unfolding clash, endurance and vision will matter far more than revenue headlines from Washington.